Samuel had always been different from the other young men around him, though he never thought of himself as special. He lived far out on the dry plains of Arizona, where the sky stretched so wide that it seemed to have no end. The sun rose early, burning hot and bright, and set behind distant mountains that looked purple and gold in the evening light. The air smelled of dust and sagebrush, and the wind carried the sound of horses' hooves across the empty land. He lived with his father in a small wooden house they had built with their own hands. It wasn't a fancy place. The floor creaked when you walked on it, and the roof sometimes let in a bit of rain during heavy storms. But it was home, and to Samuel, home meant safety and quiet. His father, a quiet and hard-working man, had raised him after his mother passed away when he was very young. Samuel barely remembered her face, only a soft voice in some distant memory. Because of this, his world had always been made up mostly of men. Ranch hands, neighbors from other farms, and his father. Women were something he saw from far away, like a breeze he could feel but not quite reach. From the time he could walk, Samuel was taught to work with his hands. At dawn, while the rest of the world still slept, he was already outside feeding the horses, checking the fences, and making sure the cattle hadn't wandered too far. He liked the sound of the morning, the soft neighing of the horses, the gentle rustling of dry grass, the chirping of birds waking up with the sun. It gave him a sense of peace. He didn't have many friends. The nearest town was many miles away, and even when he went there, he didn't stay long. He wasn't the kind of man who liked crowds or loud conversations. People in town knew Samuel. They called him the quiet ranch boy. He never started trouble. He never bragged. He kept to himself. Some thought he was shy. Others thought he was just a man who preferred silence. The truth was simple. Samuel had never learned how to speak to people easily. When he tried, his words came out slow and unsure. He always felt like he was saying the wrong thing, so he often said nothing at all. When other young men in town were learning how to dance with girls at barn parties, Samuel was out fixing fences. When they were laughing in the saloon, sharing stories and talking about love, Samuel was cleaning saddles under the stars. It wasn't that he didn't want those things. Deep down, he sometimes wondered what it would feel like to hold someone's hand or share a quiet moment with a girl who understood him. But those thoughts always passed quickly, like a cloud moving across the sun. They felt too far away for someone like him. Samuel was not unattractive. He was tall and strong from years of ranch work. His skin was tanned from the sun, and his hands were rough from ropes and wood. His dark hair curled slightly at the ends, and his green eyes carried a gentle, calm look that made people trust him easily. But his shyness made him invisible. In town, women might glance his way once, then turn their attention to louder, more confident men. And Samuel would quietly tip his hat, buy his supplies, and ride home alone. His father never pushed him to marry or find someone. The older man was practical. "You'll know when the right time comes," he often said in his low voice. Samuel nodded, though he secretly didn't believe the right time would ever come. His life seemed set like the fences around the ranch, strong, quiet, and never changing. Most of Samuel's days followed the same gentle rhythm. He would wake before the sun, saddle his horse, and ride out across the land to check on the cattle. He liked the silence of the wide open spaces. Sometimes the only sound he heard was the wind whistling past his ears or the distant call of a hawk overhead. The land stretched endlessly in every direction, dry brush, rolling hills, and a few scattered trees where the shade gave some relief from the hot sun. On certain days, when his chores were done early, he would ride to the small creek that ran near the property. There he'd sit on a rock, take off his hat, and watch the water flow slowly over the stones. He liked the sound of the creek. It was soft and steady, like a kind whisper that only he could hear. Sometimes he would talk to his horse, Jasper, as if the animal understood him, and in some quiet way Samuel believed Jasper did. Evenings on the ranch were peaceful but lonely. His father would light a lantern and they would eat simple meals together. Beans, bread, sometimes dried meat. After dinner, his father would fall asleep in his chair and Samuel would step outside, leaning against the wooden railing, looking at the stars. The night sky was always clear, filled with countless shining lights. He often imagined what life was like beyond the hills, beyond the town. He dreamed of adventures, though he never dared to chase them. The few times he had spoken to women had been brief and awkward. Once, years ago, at a fair in town, a girl around his age had asked him to dance. She had freckles across her nose and a soft smile. Samuel's heart had raced, but his feet had felt like stones. He stumbled over his words, grew red in the face, and she laughed gently. Not to be mean, but because she didn't know what else to do. He remembered that moment for years afterward. It was a reminder of how far away that world felt to him. Still, Samuel was not unhappy. His quiet life gave him comfort. He loved the land, the horses, and the sky. He was grateful for the small things: the cool wind after a hot day, the smell of rain when a storm rolled in, the warmth of a fire at night. Yet deep down, a small part of him wondered what it would feel like to not be so alone. The town was small but lively. Whenever Samuel rode in for supplies, he noticed the way people moved in groups: friends talking on the wooden porches, couples walking hand in hand, children laughing in the dusty streets. He watched from a distance, tipping his hat politely when someone greeted him. He always thought people were like rivers flowing together, while he was a rock on the edge, watching the water pass by. Samuel's father sometimes tried to encourage him to speak more. "You've got a good heart, boy," he would say. "One day someone will see that." Samuel would just smile a little and nod. It wasn't that he didn't believe his father. He just didn't know how that someone would ever find him when he spent most of his life so far away from everything. Despite his quiet nature, Samuel had a kind soul. When a neighbor needed help fixing a fence or rounding up cattle, he was the first to arrive, even if no one asked. He didn't speak much, but his actions always spoke louder. People trusted him. They respected his steady hands and honest work. There was one thing Samuel loved more than anything else: riding. When he was on Jasper's back, the world felt different. The wind against his face made him feel alive in a way nothing else did. Out there on the open land, he didn't need to talk. He didn't need to pretend. He could just be. The horse understood his gentle touch, and together they moved as if they were part of the same breath of wind. Though he had never known love, Samuel often imagined what it might feel like. Sometimes, when the night was quiet and the stars bright, he pictured someone sitting beside him on the porch listening to the crickets sing, someone whose presence made the silence feel warm, not empty. It was a quiet dream, one he never told anyone, not even his father. The land around their ranch was changing slowly. More settlers were moving in, more wagons traveled through the town, and traders came with goods from places Samuel had never seen. Among those travelers were people from different tribes and communities, including the Apache. Samuel had seen them from afar at the trading posts, their clothing and jewelry different from anything he'd known. They carried themselves with quiet strength. He never spoke to them, though sometimes their eyes met briefly in passing. One spring morning, as the sun rose over the plains, painting the land with golden light, Samuel didn't know that something would soon happen that would change everything. It would not be loud or sudden like a storm. It would be soft, like the touch of a breeze, like a voice that asks gently instead of shouting. He didn't know that someone was about to step quietly into his life and shift the world he thought would never change. He didn't know that a girl with dark, calm eyes would one day ask to ride with him. And he didn't know that moment would stay in his heart forever. For now, Samuel only knew the rhythm of his simple life, the sound of hooves, the open sky, and the quiet hope he kept hidden inside his chest. Samuel didn't visit town often, but on that early spring morning, something inside him said to saddle up Jasper and ride in. The winter had been long and dry, and their supplies at the ranch were running low. He needed flour, coffee, and some rope for the fence. The sun was still rising as he placed the saddle on Jasper's back, giving the horse a soft pat on the neck. Jasper gave a low, warm sound as if answering him. Samuel liked mornings like this, the air cool, the land quiet, and the sky soft pink like a painted canvas. The ride to town took a few hours. Samuel didn't mind. He liked the open road. Dust rose softly beneath Jasper's hooves as they moved along the narrow trail. The wind brushed against his face and birds circled high above. It was one of those peaceful days when everything around him felt calm. He wasn't expecting anything different to happen. His days, after all, usually followed the same simple pattern. But sometimes life changes quietly without a sound. As he neared the town, he saw the familiar sight of small wooden buildings lined along a single main road. A few wagons were parked outside, and the sound of people talking and horses moving filled the air. Smoke rose from the bakery chimney, carrying the smell of warm bread. Children ran across the street laughing. Samuel slowed Jasper down and guided him toward the hitching post near the general store. He dismounted, tied Jasper gently, and dusted off his hat. He walked toward the store with his usual quiet steps, nodding politely at a few familiar faces. Some men greeted him with a quick "Morning, Sam," and he replied with a slight smile. He didn't talk much, but people respected him. He had a good reputation, not for being loud or bold, but for being steady, honest, and kind. As he reached the store, something caught his eye near the trading area. A small group of Apache traders had arrived that morning. Samuel had seen them before during past visits. They came every few weeks to trade woven blankets, handmade baskets, beaded jewelry, and other beautiful things made with great care. Samuel always admired their quiet strength. They didn't need loud words to make their presence known. They simply moved with calm dignity. Among the traders was a young Apache girl. She stood a little apart from the others, arranging colorful woven cloth on a wooden table. The morning sun fell softly on her face, making her dark eyes shine. Her long black hair was braided neatly down her back, and tiny beads decorated the ends. She wasn't dressed like the town girls, who often wore wide skirts and ribbons in their hair. Her clothes were simple and beautiful, made from soft fabric that moved gently in the breeze. Samuel didn't know why, but his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than usual. She wasn't like anyone he had ever seen up close. She moved with quiet confidence, her hands steady and graceful. She didn't seem nervous about being surrounded by strangers. She didn't speak much, but when she did, her voice was calm and clear. Samuel didn't catch her words, but he noticed how even her silence carried a kind of strength. He quickly looked away, feeling his heartbeat quicken for reasons he didn't quite understand. He went inside the general store and started collecting the things he needed: flour, rope, a small bag of coffee beans. But even as he walked through the store, his mind drifted outside. He had lived his whole life in quiet routine. And now, something as simple as the sight of a girl arranging cloth under the morning sun had stirred something inside him. It was a soft, unfamiliar feeling. When he stepped out of the store with his supplies, he saw her again. This time she was talking with the shopkeeper, exchanging baskets for goods. A few town women stood nearby, curious but polite. Samuel walked slowly toward Jasper, pretending to check the saddle straps, though his eyes were drawn back to her. At one moment she looked up and their eyes met. It was not a long look, just a few seconds. But something in that glance felt different. Her eyes were calm, not hurried or shy. She didn't turn away quickly like many girls in town usually did. She simply looked at him as if seeing him, not just passing by him. Samuel felt a small flutter in his chest. He didn't smile widely. He wasn't the kind of man who showed big emotions. But he lifted his hat slightly as a quiet greeting. To his surprise, she gave a gentle nod in return. For the rest of that day, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling of that brief moment. On his way back to the ranch, the wind carried the scent of spring flowers, and the road stretched wide before him. Yet all he could think about was her. The way she moved, the way her eyes didn't rush away. It wasn't love. It wasn't something he could name. It was simply a feeling that something in his quiet world had shifted ever so slightly. A few weeks later, another storm rolled in across the plains. Thick clouds covered the sky and the wind grew colder. Samuel and his father worked quickly to bring the cattle closer to the ranch and secure the fences. Rain began to fall softly at first, then stronger, turning the dirt into dark, wet earth. Storms like these didn't come often, but when they did, travelers sometimes sought shelter at nearby ranches. That evening, just as Samuel finished checking the barn, he saw a small wagon approaching through the rain. He could just make out figures covered with cloaks. As they came closer, he realized they were Apache traders, likely the same group he had seen in town before. They looked tired and wet from the rain. His father stepped out onto the porch and gave a small nod. "Storm's going to be rough," his father said in a low voice. "We can offer them shelter." Samuel helped guide the wagon into the barn, making sure the horses were safe and dry. The traders thanked them in quiet, respectful voices. Among them was the same young woman he had seen weeks earlier. She stepped down from the wagon, her dark braid damp from the rain, small drops clinging to the beads in her hair. Even soaked from the storm, she carried herself with the same quiet strength. Samuel felt his throat tighten slightly, though he didn't know why. She gave him a small nod, the same gentle nod she had given that day in town. It wasn't forced. It wasn't shy. It was warm and calm. Inside the house, his father offered them dry blankets and warm soup. The small living room filled with the soft crackle of fire and the scent of the broth cooking. Samuel sat quietly by the window, listening to the soft rain against the roof. He wasn't used to having guests. The house felt different, fuller, warmer somehow. The traders spoke quietly among themselves in their language, their voices like music to his ears. He didn't understand the words, but the sound was gentle, almost like the wind passing through leaves. The girl sat near the fire, drying her cloak. Her hands were folded in her lap, and her eyes seemed to study everything around her with calm curiosity. Samuel didn't know how to talk to her, so he didn't. He just stole small, careful glances, trying not to seem obvious. But a strange thing happened. A few times when he looked her way, she was already looking at him too. Not with judgment, not with fear, just quiet interest. That night, when the rain grew heavier, Samuel went outside to check on the horses again. He always did before sleeping, just to be sure they were calm. The barn was warm and smelled of hay and wet leather. As he opened the door, he realized someone else was already inside. It was her. She was standing near Jasper, gently running her hand along his neck. Jasper stood perfectly still, his ears flicking lightly. Jasper usually didn't let strangers touch him easily, but with her he seemed at peace. Samuel stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure if he should speak. Finally, he said softly, "He likes you." She turned slowly, meeting his eyes again. There was no fear or surprise in her face, just a small, soft smile. "He is kind," she said quietly in a clear voice. Samuel felt his heart beat faster, though he tried to act calm. "His name's Jasper," he added, stepping a little closer. The sound of the rain outside was steady and soft, like background music to their quiet conversation. She nodded, repeating softly, "Jasper." She said it carefully, as if learning the name with respect. They didn't talk much more. They didn't need to. For Samuel, that simple exchange was more meaningful than any long speech. It was the first time in a long time that silence between him and another person didn't feel heavy. It felt warm. When he returned to the house that night, he lay in bed listening to the rain. His world, which had always been made of quiet routines, now carried a new kind of quiet, one that was not lonely. A gentle spark had entered his life like a soft light in a dark room. The rain finally stopped the next morning, leaving the world soft and quiet. The air smelled fresh, like the earth had taken a deep breath. Drops of water still clung to the branches, and the muddy ground squished lightly beneath Samuel's boots as he stepped out of the house. The sun was just rising, painting everything in shades of gold and soft pink. The storm had passed, and a calm silence wrapped around the ranch. Samuel liked mornings like this, when clean and peaceful. The clouds were still hanging low in the distance, but a gentle breeze carried the smell of wet soil and wildflowers. He walked toward the barn, knowing the horses would be restless after being kept in during the storm. Jasper neighed softly when he saw him. Samuel smiled a little and patted the horse's neck, whispering, "Good morning, boy." Inside the barn, everything was still. The Apache traders who had taken shelter during the storm were beginning to stir. Some were packing their things quietly, preparing to leave once the ground dried. Samuel saw the young woman, too. She was brushing off the water from her cloak and carefully folding the woven cloth she had brought. Her movements were slow and thoughtful, like someone who respected everything they touched. For a moment, Samuel stood there watching her, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but quietly, like someone who was seeing a sunrise for the first time and wanted to remember it. She didn't seem bothered by his presence. In fact, when she noticed him, she met his eyes calmly and offered a small, warm nod. The same gentle nod she'd given him before. Something about her presence always made the space feel softer, like the wind slowing down. His father called out from the house, asking him to check the fence line that might have been damaged by the rain. Samuel nodded and turned back to Jasper, tightening the saddle straps and checking the stirrups. It was a job he had done 100 times before. But today felt different. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the quiet after the storm. Maybe it was her. When Samuel walked Jasper out of the barn, the young woman followed a few steps behind. He noticed it but didn't turn around right away. The sun caught her dark hair, making the beads at the end of her braid sparkle like little drops of light. She was holding a small shawl around her shoulders. Her steps were quiet, soft against the damp ground. She didn't say anything at first. She just watched him prepare the horse. Finally, in a voice soft and gentle, she spoke.
May I ride with you?
The words were simple. She didn't say them with shyness nor with boldness. They came out smooth and calm, like the water in the creek near his ranch. For a second, Samuel thought he had imagined it. He turned to look at her, his hand still on the saddle. She stood there, looking at him with a steady gaze. Not demanding, not uncertain, just waiting for an answer. Samuel had never heard a woman ask him something like that before. His heart gave a strange little jump inside his chest. He wasn't used to moments like this. For a brief second, his mind went blank. He felt the warm morning air brush against his face and the sound of birds singing somewhere far off. Everything around him seemed to pause. The land, the wind, the sound of the barn door gently creaking in the breeze. He didn't know what to say, but something in her eyes made the answer simple. He gave a small nod. Yes, he said softly. Her lips curved into the smallest smile. Not a wide one, just a gentle lift, like sunlight breaking through thin clouds. She stepped closer, and Samuel instinctively extended his hand to help her up onto Jasper's back. His hand felt warm and a little unsteady, but her hand was calm and sure. She didn't hesitate. She placed her hand in his and climbed up behind him with grace and ease. Samuel had never shared Jasper with anyone like this. He could feel the slight shift in balance as she settled herself behind him, lightly holding on to the back of the saddle. Her presence was gentle, but it filled the quiet space around him like a warm breeze. He could hear her steady breathing close behind him. His heart, which was usually calm and quiet like the land he lived on, now beat faster than he was used to. Hold on, he said softly, not turning his head. She placed her hands lightly on the back of his waist, not too tight, just enough to steady herself. It was the first time Samuel had ever felt someone so close. Not in a crowded room, not by accident, but here on the open land with the sun warming their backs and the world still fresh from rain. It was a quiet touch, soft and respectful, but to Samuel it felt like everything had shifted. Jasper started moving at a slow, easy pace, his hooves making soft sounds against the damp earth. Samuel kept his eyes on the path, but he was aware of every small thing. The warmth of her hands through his shirt, the gentle rustle of her shawl in the breeze, the faint scent of wildflowers that seemed to follow her. He had never felt so aware of another person before. The land stretched wide around them. The storm had washed away the dust and everything looked brighter, clearer. The fence line they were riding toward lay a few miles away, with soft hills rolling in the distance. Birds fluttered from tree to tree. The creek nearby sparkled in the sunlight. It was the kind of morning that made everything feel new, even to someone like Samuel who had seen this land all his life. They didn't speak much as they rode. She sat quietly behind him, and he felt no need to fill the silence. It was a comfortable quiet, the kind that doesn't press on your chest but instead rests gently like a warm blanket. At one point, Jasper stepped over a shallow puddle and she let out a soft laugh. It wasn't loud. It wasn't forced. It was light like bells ringing far away. Samuel felt the sound settle inside him, warm and steady. It was a laugh that made the world feel less lonely. As they rode further, Samuel began to talk. Just a little. He wasn't good with long speeches, but something about the way she listened made it easier. He pointed toward the hills and said, "The cattle graze there when the grass grows long." She turned her head slightly, following his gaze, and nodded, as if she was seeing the land not just with her eyes but with understanding. Then he added, "There's a small creek behind the trees. I go there when I want quiet." She replied softly, "Quiet is good." Her voice was gentle, and the words felt simple, but to Samuel they carried weight. She understood quiet. She didn't rush to fill the air with words. She didn't make him feel like he needed to be someone else. She was just there, and that was enough. When they reached the broken part of the fence, Samuel stopped Jasper and climbed down. She watched as he checked the wooden posts and tightened the wire. She didn't stay on the horse like someone waiting to leave. Instead, she climbed down too and stood nearby, holding Jasper's reins carefully like she had known how to do it all her life. She didn't speak, but her presence made the work feel lighter. Samuel usually worked alone. He was used to the silence of the land and the sound of his own footsteps. But with her standing a few feet away, everything felt a little less empty. He could feel the warmth of her quiet gaze on him as he fixed the fence. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was steady and kind. When the job was done, Samuel wiped his hands on his trousers and looked toward the open field. She followed his gaze again, standing beside him. The land stretched endlessly and a soft breeze moved through the grass like a whisper. He realized standing there that he had never shared this view with anyone. Not like this. Not with someone who stood beside him in silence and still made the moment feel full. On the way back, she didn't sit stiffly like a stranger. She leaned slightly forward, holding on to him a little closer. It wasn't because she needed to. Jasper's pace was calm and sure, but because the quiet between them had grown warmer. Samuel's heart beat faster again, but this time it didn't scare him. It felt right. It felt like the land itself was holding its breath with him. When they returned to the barn, she climbed down lightly, landing softly on the damp ground. She turned to him and said in a quiet voice, "Thank you." Just 2 words, but they carried something deeper, a softness that settled deep in his chest. Her smile wasn't wide, but it stayed in her eyes even after her lips went still. Samuel watched as she walked toward her group, her shawl brushing lightly against the morning air. He stood beside Jasper, not moving for a moment. The world around him looked the same, the ranch, the fences, the wide sky. But something inside him had changed. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a quiet shift, like the earth slowly warming after a cold night. That morning became a memory that wrapped itself around his heart, not because of big words or grand gestures, but because of the softness of it all. A girl had asked to ride with him, and in that simple moment, his quiet world had grown larger. He didn't know where life would lead after that day. He didn't know if she would stay or if their paths would cross again in the same way. But he knew one thing clearly. That feeling of shared silence, the warmth of someone behind him as Jasper carried them across the open land, was something he would never forget. Samuel couldn't stop thinking about that morning. Even after the horses were settled back into the barn and the sun had climbed higher in the sky, the memory stayed with him like a soft echo. He had ridden across the land 1,000 times before, but never like that. Never with someone sitting quietly behind him, sharing the same wind, the same view, the same silence. He walked slowly toward the house, his boots sinking a little into the soft ground that the rain had left behind. The breeze was gentle now, carrying the scent of wet earth and blooming flowers. Spring always had a way of making the ranch look alive. But that day everything looked even brighter to Samuel. It was as if the sunlight had found a new way to fall across the land, warming not just the ground but something inside him too. Inside the house. His father was sitting at the small wooden table drinking coffee. "Fence hold up?" the old man asked in his usual calm voice. Samuel nodded, placing his gloves on the table. "It's fine now. Just needed tightening." His father gave a slow nod, then looked at him a little more carefully. Samuel didn't realize it at first, but there was a softness in his face that hadn't been there when he left. His father tilted his head slightly, almost as if he could sense something different. "You seem lighter," he said quietly. Samuel gave a small, unsure smile and shook his head. "Just a good morning, I guess." The truth was too new, too gentle to put into words. How could he explain that a few quiet moments on horseback had changed the way the day felt? How could he describe the feeling of another person's presence in a way that wasn't loud or complicated, but soft and steady, like water filling an empty cup? Outside, the Apache traders were gathering their things. The storm had passed and the road was clear. Soon they would be on their way. Samuel stepped out onto the porch, leaning on the wooden railing as he often did in the evenings. Though it was still early afternoon, he watched as they loaded their baskets and cloth into their wagon. The horses they brought with them stamped their hooves gently, ready to travel. And then he saw her. She was standing near the wagon, adjusting her shawl, the wind catching a loose strand of her dark hair. The beads at the end of her braid glimmered softly in the sun. Samuel didn't move for a moment. He just watched quietly. She was talking to one of the older women in her group, but she turned her head slightly and her eyes met his from across the yard. It wasn't a long look. It didn't need to be. That single glance was enough to bring back the feeling of her soft hands holding on to him as they rode through the fields. She gave him a small smile. Not wide, not forced, but gentle and true. Samuel felt warmth spread through his chest like the sun climbing higher in the sky. He wanted to say something. Anything. But Samuel wasn't a man of big words. He didn't know how to turn feelings into sentences. So he did the only thing that felt natural. He lifted his hand slightly in a quiet wave. She didn't hesitate. She raised her hand back. Soon after, the wagon began to roll out of the yard, the sound of the wheels blending with the songs of the birds. The traders moved down the dusty road slowly, their figures growing smaller in the distance. Samuel watched until they disappeared behind the low hills. The wind blew gently against his face, and even when the wagon was gone, the feeling remained. That night, Samuel couldn't sleep as quickly as he usually did. He lay in bed with his hands behind his head, staring up at the wooden ceiling. The soft sound of crickets filled the night, and Jasper made a faint noise in the barn outside. The stars shone through the window, scattered like tiny lanterns in the dark sky. His life had always been a quiet one. He had learned to accept it, the long days, the silence, the way the world moved slowly around him. But after that morning, the silence felt different. Not empty, not cold. It was warm, like it was holding something inside it, something small but bright. He remembered the way her laughter had sounded when Jasper stepped over the puddle. Light and free, he remembered how she had leaned forward slightly as they rode back, and how that simple gesture had made the world feel a little less lonely. He remembered her calm voice saying, "May I ride with you?" as if it was the most natural question in the world. For years, Samuel had believed that life was set like the fences he built, straight, quiet, unchanging. But now he understood that sometimes something gentle could come along and shift everything without warning, not with noise, not with force, but with kindness. The next few days returned to their usual rhythm. Samuel worked on the ranch from sunrise to sunset, mending fences, tending to the horses, and riding out to check the land. But everything he saw felt just a little different. The creek near the trees, where he often sat alone, now carried the memory of her voice. The trail where Jasper had carried the two of them felt less like just a path and more like a memory, stitched softly into the land. He began to notice small things he had overlooked before. The way the wildflowers along the path bloomed after rain, the sound of the wind moving gently through the grass, the way the sunlight hit the hills at certain hours, turning the land golden. It was as if something inside him had opened a little, allowing the world to step in more clearly. In the town, people noticed a quiet change too. Samuel still didn't talk much, but when he greeted people, his voice carried a warmth that hadn't been there before. When he worked, there was a lightness in his steps, even if he didn't realize it himself. It wasn't loud enough for everyone to point out, but those who knew him well, the storekeeper, the blacksmith, even the older folks who sat on the porch, could sense something gentle had shifted. Every time Samuel rode into town for supplies, he found himself glancing around, half expecting to see the traders again. He didn't know if she would return, but the thought of it wasn't heavy. It was a soft hope, like waiting for the first warm breeze of spring after a long winter. One evening, he rode Jasper out to the creek. The sun was setting, painting the sky with streaks of orange and gold. The water sparkled as it moved slowly over the stones. Samuel sat on his usual rock, removed his hat, and let the cool breeze brush across his face. He thought about the way she had looked at the land when he showed her the hills. He thought about how she seemed to understand the quiet, how she didn't fill it with words. Samuel didn't know much about her, not where she lived, not what she liked, not what stories her life carried. But somehow that didn't matter. What mattered was how she had made the silence between them feel warm. As the sky grew darker, he whispered softly to Jasper. She wasn't like anyone else. The horse flicked his ears and lowered his head as if listening. Samuel smiled faintly. Jasper didn't understand words the way people did, but he understood feelings. The days continued to pass, but the memory didn't fade. It didn't become dull or distant. Instead, it became part of the land itself, part of the way Samuel breathed, worked, and dreamed. It was a quiet reminder that even the smallest moments can change a heart. One night, his father sat beside him on the porch, both of them staring at the stars. The older man didn't say much as usual, but after a long stretch of silence, he spoke softly. "You've been different lately, son." Samuel turned his head slightly. "Different how?" "Not in a bad way," his father said. "Just lighter. Like something good happened." Samuel looked out at the dark fields, the soft wind moving through the tall grass. He didn't know how to explain what had happened without turning it into something bigger than it was, so he just said quietly, "Maybe something did." His father nodded slowly, not asking more. He understood silence, too. Some things didn't need to be spoken aloud to be real. In his heart, Samuel carried the memory of her hands resting lightly against him as they rode across the land. He remembered the sound of her voice and the soft warmth of her presence. And though she was gone for now, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the beginning of a story written not in loud words but in quiet moments. That single ride had changed the way Samuel saw his world. The fences were still there. The land was still wide. His routines were the same. But inside him, something had shifted. Sometimes change doesn't come like a thunderstorm. It comes like a soft breeze, wrapping around your heart and leaving behind a feeling that never fully goes away. For Samuel, it came in the shape of a girl with calm eyes, a quiet smile, and a simple question that would stay with him forever. "May I ride with you?" The days slowly turned into weeks, and the bright green of spring began to spread across the land. The grass grew taller, the air grew warmer, and the sound of the wind seemed softer. Life on the ranch went on as it always had, feeding the horses, mending the fences, checking the cattle, and riding across the same familiar fields. But even as the world looked the same, something inside Samuel had changed. He didn't talk about it to anyone. He didn't even try to put it into words for himself. But the memory of that morning, the way the air felt fresh after the rain, the way the sun had wrapped the land in light, the way her soft voice had asked, "May I ride with you?" lived inside him like a warm flame that didn't go out. He had always known this land to be wide and quiet. For years he rode across it alone, hearing only the sound of Jasper's hooves and the wind brushing past his ears. But now whenever he rode along that same path, he could almost feel her presence again. It was as if her gentle laughter still floated on the breeze, as if her soft hand still rested lightly against his back. The Apache traders didn't return right away. He didn't know when or if they would come again, but Samuel found that the thought of her wasn't heavy. It wasn't like a weight pressing down on his heart. It was light and steady, like a song you remember without needing to hear the music again. In the early mornings, when the sun rose and the mist hung low over the fields, Samuel often rode Jasper to the same place where the two of them had passed that day. The fence stood strong where he had repaired it, and the puddles from the storm had long since dried. But the memory of that ride lived in the air itself. Sometimes he would stop Jasper in the middle of the trail, take off his hat, and just close his eyes. He could almost hear the sound of her quiet breath, the way her shawl moved softly in the wind, and the gentle way she said "thank you" when they returned to the barn. The memory didn't fade. It grew softer, deeper, becoming a part of him. One afternoon, as the sun was beginning to lower behind the hills, Samuel's father found him sitting on the porch, lost in thought. The old man leaned against the railing, his hands resting on the wood. "You've been out there riding a lot lately," he said with a small smile. Samuel nodded. "I like the quiet." His father studied him for a moment and then said, "The quiet's always been here, but now it looks like you're hearing something different in it." Samuel didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. His father wasn't asking for details. He had lived long enough to understand that sometimes the heart holds things that don't need to be explained. Finally, Samuel said softly, "Maybe I am." That night, the stars filled the sky like tiny lanterns, shining against the blackness. Samuel sat on the porch alone after his father had gone to bed. The wind was warm, and the sound of crickets floated through the night. He leaned back in his chair, looking up at the stars, and wondered where she was. Maybe she was sitting beside a fire with her family, under the same stars. Maybe she was riding across another stretch of land, the same way he was here. The thought didn't make him sad. It made him feel connected, not to a single person, but to something bigger, something quiet and kind that existed between people even when they were far apart. One day, as the summer sun grew hotter, he rode into town for supplies. He tied Jasper to the same post outside the general store and stepped inside. The storekeeper greeted him and they talked briefly, as they always did. But as Samuel walked back out, his eyes swept across the trading area almost out of habit. And there they were. The Apache traders had returned. Their wagon was parked under the shade of a big tree, and they were setting up their cloth and baskets. His heart gave a small, quick thump inside his chest, not from surprise exactly, but from something warm rising up quietly. And then he saw her. She was arranging the woven cloth again, her braid shining in the sunlight. She looked the same, yet something about seeing her again after so many weeks felt new. The memory of that ride was still fresh inside him, but now it was joined by the real sight of her, standing just a few feet away. She turned slightly, as if sensing someone watching her, and their eyes met. For a brief moment, the world around him, the sound of wagons, voices, the wind, all seemed to fade away. She gave him the same gentle nod, that calm look in her eyes, and a small smile curved at the corners of her lips. Samuel felt something in him relax, as if the wind itself had just brushed against his chest. He didn't rush over. He didn't speak loudly. He simply walked slowly toward the trading area, the same way the breeze moves across the land, steady and quiet. When he reached her, he lifted his hat slightly, just as he had the first time they met. She smiled again, this time a little wider, like she had remembered too. For a few seconds they just stood there, the air around them warm and still. "Hello?" Samuel said softly. "Hello?" she answered, her voice calm and clear, just as he remembered. There wasn't a rush to say everything at once. They didn't need many words. Sometimes silence speaks louder than 100 sentences. The quiet between them was gentle, the same kind of quiet they had shared during that ride. Samuel helped carry a few baskets from the wagon without even being asked. She didn't thank him right away. She simply looked at him with a softness that said more than words could. They worked side by side for a little while, and it felt natural, as if they had done it many times before. Later, as the sun lowered behind the rooftops of the small town, Samuel stood beside Jasper, getting ready to return home. She walked up to him, her shawl catching the golden light. They didn't speak for long. She just looked at him with her calm, steady eyes and said softly, "The land is quiet here." Samuel nodded. "It is," he answered. Then after a small pause, he said quietly, "But it doesn't feel as quiet as it used to." She understood what he meant. She didn't laugh or look away. She simply smiled, a smile that felt like warm light spreading slowly through the air. That evening, as Samuel rode home under the soft orange sky, Jasper's hooves kicking up small clouds of dust, he felt a peacefulness settle inside him. This time it wasn't just a memory. She had returned, and her presence was just as calm, just as warm as it had been before. Over the weeks that followed, her visits to town became something he quietly looked forward to. He didn't tell anyone, not his father, not the neighbors. It was something gentle he kept close to his heart, like a small secret that didn't need to be spoken aloud to be real. Sometimes they only exchanged a few words. Other times they sat quietly near the trading area as the sun went down. She spoke about the wind and the hills, about how the land changed with each season. He told her about the ranch, the horses, the quiet creek where he liked to sit. Their conversations were never loud, but they were full of something steady, the kind of understanding that doesn't need much explaining. And even when she left again with her people, Samuel no longer felt the same kind of emptiness he once did. The quiet after her visits was not cold. It was warm, filled with the soft memory of her voice, her presence, and the knowledge that their paths had crossed in a way that left something lasting behind. Years would pass, and Samuel would keep living his quiet life on the ranch. He would continue to ride Jasper across the open fields, mend fences, and watch the sun rise and set over the wide sky. But that gentle moment, the soft question, the shared ride, the warmth of someone sitting behind him, would remain in his heart like a part of the land itself. He would grow older, his hands rougher from work, his hair touched by the sun and wind, but some things never faded. The memory of her calm eyes and gentle voice stayed bright, even when the seasons changed. Not every story needs to be loud or full of grand gestures. Some stories live quietly, like rivers flowing beneath the surface of the land, steady, strong, and endless. For Samuel, the story of that ride was one of those. It was not about owning or losing. It was about a moment, a simple, soft moment, that opened a door inside his heart. A door that had been closed for a long time. Many years later, he would still ride down the same trail, the breeze brushing past his face, the land stretching wide before him. And sometimes, when the wind was just right, it felt as if someone was still there behind him, quiet, gentle, and kind. A girl had once asked, "May I ride with you?" And with those few words, his world had quietly changed.